Well guys, this is finally long overdue. It's now finally here. I had made this theory back in 2018, and over the last few months in my spare time because I've been busy, I was able to remake it as it was not really good, and this one is much better. And that is, what if Favre stayed with the Falcons? And this is going to be a four-parter, as it is a long one, and it's going to be very interesting, especially now they've completely remade it. So, what would happen if Favre stayed with the Falcons? We are now going to find out. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if? An NFL theory. So, for all of you that didn't know, Favre, although he was well known for being on the Packers, that was not his original team. He originally was drafted by the Falcons in the second round of the 1991 draft. He played for an entire year there, and after the season, he was traded to the Packers, who were trying to draft him in 1991, but the Falcons got him the literal pick before they could. And he would then eventually become the starter of them and would be the starter all the way up to 2007 before he went on his 3-year journey with the Jets and Vikings. But in this scenario, what if he stayed on the Falcons, and would he perhaps take over? We're going to find out now, as here we go in this four-parter, starting from 1992 to 1996. But before we get into 1992, we have to quickly talk about 1991. So, when Favre was drafted by the Falcons, the coach at the time, Jerry Glanville, did not want anything to do with Favre, and he did not really play him much in 1991. And that would most likely continue in 1992, since the Falcons, in this scenario, refused to trade him. Now, in 1992, the Falcons, their quarterbacks, statistically, because they had like 3 quarterbacks that played pretty good. So Favre, he would have a tough time getting a chance on the team since his coach didn't want him and the Falcons quarterbacks were playing solid. But the one thing in his saving grace was that they went 6-10 in 1992. So they were bad and their quarterbacks had to keep getting swapped out. So maybe in this scenario, he would have a chance. And if he gets that one chance, he could shine, because he played good in 1992, almost getting the Packers into the playoffs. So in this timeline, he does get a chance sometime during the year, but in the end, it didn't change much for the Falcons, as they still went 6-10. For the Packers, meanwhile, without Favre, they would stick Don Majkowski when he got back from his injury and whoever else left. But, combined with Majkowski's pretty similar touchdown ratio to Favre had in 1992, combined with a lot of the Packers games being blowouts, the Packers actually don't change that much as they improve to 8-8 instead of the 9-7 under Favre. And the updated 1992 stands, nothing ends up changing though, as the playoffs still remain the same. We now go into 1993, where we get our first other QB change in the season, and that is Bobby Herbert, who was the Saints quarterback for like the last 7 years or so. Now in real life in 1993, he went on to sign with the Falcons in free agency. But of course, the Falcons have Favre right now, and perhaps he did good enough to secure himself the starting job going into 1993. So they really don't need Herbert. So then the question is, where would he go? And of course, from 30 years ago, I could not find any information on where else he could have possibly gone, and I've searched hard to find anything. So, instead, to fill up a hole, as I like to do a lot in my theories, I decided, you know what? Have him go sign with the Packers. That way now, they have a quarterback to replace Favre since they don't have him. So now let's get into 1993. In 1993, Favre played not as good as he did in 1992, and his first full season as the Packers starter, the Falcons completely implode as they went 3-13, as they don't have the offensive production that they had in the last 2 years. And of course, Jerry Glanville would be fired, so Favre would maybe still have another chance of a second coach. Meanwhile, the Packers with Bobby Herbert, who ended up having a Pro Bowl season in 1993, did much better without Favre as they go 10-6. And the updated 1993 stands, the only thing that changes is the Packers and Vikings swap playoff seedings. But once again, I don't think anything would change the outcome of the playoffs. We now go into the 1994 offseason where we have another quarterback change. And that is now Jeff George, who was the number 1 overall pick in 1990. In 1993 and 1994, he was traded from the Colts to the Falcons. Now, of course, in this timeline, I still don't think they would probably trade for him, even though Favre did not have a good year in 1993. I still think that they would still give him another chance. So, that trade doesn't happen. So then, where does George go? This took quite a lot of thinking because there were so many teams to think of, and there was not much info on where else the Colts could have traded him. So I decided a team that easily needed a QB for their moment would be the Rams. So that is where he would be traded to. In the 1994 season, the patience with Favre finally paid off as he had a much better season, and the Falcons played really good as they go 10-6 to get their first winning season since 1991. Meanwhile, for the Packers, Bobby Herbert did not have a good year in 1994 as they bombed out to 5-11, their first losing season since 1991. And of course, the Rams with Jeff George, he did not play that good that year, so they still finished 4-12 like they did in real life. And the updated 1994 playoff stands, the only thing that changes is the NFC side, where the Falcons make the playoffs as the 5th seed, and the Giants make the playoffs as the 6th seed. And in the playoffs, the wildcard round, Favre plays his first game with the Falcons as their quarterback in the playoffs as they visit the Lions. Now, I kind of compare this game to the real-life game between the Packers and the Lions in 1994 wildcard round, where Favre didn't play that impressively, and they barely beat the Lions 16-12. Now, of course, the Falcons, even with Favre, are going to be worse than the Packers. So if the Packers barely beat the Lions, how are they going to beat the Lions who are on the road and are the worst team? So, Favre's first playoff game, I have the Lions winning. And the rest of the playoffs remains the same otherwise. We then finally get into a first year without any change in the offseason, as we're in 1995, as Favre would break out and with his first MVP season on a strong Falcons offense, as the Falcons surprise everyone by going 13-3 to clinch home field advantage for only the first time since 1980. Meanwhile, for the Packers, Bobby Herbert still doesn't play as good as Favre, and it comes up back to cost them as they go 7-9. Meanwhile, Jeff George still struggling down in St. Louis now as the Rams only improved to 6-10. And the updated 1995 playoff stands, the only thing that changes, of course, in the NFC is the Falcons move up to the number 1 seed, the Cowboys fall to the 2 seed, the Bears make the playoffs as the 3rd seed, the Lions move up to the 4th seed, the Eagles fall down to the 5th seed, and the 49ers fall all the way down to the 6th seed. And in the first wildcard game we'll be covering the 49ers at Bears. The 49ers would crush the Bears with no effort. And then the divisional round as the 49ers visit the Falcons. Now remember, the Favre and the Packers from this period from 1995 to 1997 just manhandled the 49ers. The 49ers could not beat the Packers during this stretch. And that shows up here as Favre decimates the 49ers defense as they struggled like they did against the Packers, and the Falcons win it to go to the conference championship for the first time ever, where they would host the Cowboys. But unfortunately for the Falcons, the reverse was true for Favre during pretty much the entire 90s, where the Packers and Favre could not beat the Cowboys at all. And that will show up here, combined with the Falcons being a worse team overall than the Packers were. So the Cowboys go into the Georgia Dome and beat the Falcons, and with that, the Super Bowl remains the same. And then we wrap up the period with the final year, 1996, as it was an up and down year for the Falcons. On the one hand, Favre has his second MVP season as he plays really well, but the problem with the Falcons is that they were one of the worst teams in 1996. They went 3-13 in real life, and that is going to balance it out, as unfortunately the Falcons, after going 3-13 in 1995, completely bomb out as they fall to just barely 8-8 and missing the playoffs. Meanwhile, for the Packers, Bobby Herbert doesn't play really good. He threw a lot of touchdowns, but he led the league in interceptions with 25. But fortunately for him, the Packers, remember, still had the #1 defense in the league, and most of their games were such blowouts that even all the interceptions that led the points back were not enough, as the Packers went 10-6 still, improving from the last year. And the Jeff George-led Rams still struggles. They only improved to 6-9-1. And there are a lot of changes in the 1996 stands. First off, in the AFC, the Chiefs actually make the playoffs the 6th seed as the Jaguars miss out. Meanwhile, for the NFC side, the Panthers in their second season get home field advantage. The Packers fall to the 2nd seed. The Eagles move up to the 3rd seed. The 49ers still at the 4th seed. The Cowboys fall to the 5th seed. And the Redskins make the playoffs as the 6th seed. What a crazy wild card week we would have, as on the AFC side, the Chiefs visit the Steelers, and the Chiefs would get crushed as the Steelers would put up 40 points like they did on the Colts. Meanwhile, the Colts would visit the Bills, as they would struggle, as the Bills would get the win. And the NFC side, the Redskins visit the Eagles, and the Eagles, remember, struggled that week against the 49ers. They couldn't put up any points whatsoever. And the Redskins are good enough to keep that points down enough to get the upset victory, as the 49ers host the Cowboys. And of course, the Cowboys during this time just rarely lost to 49ers, and that would continue on as they would get the win over the 49ers as they struggled as well. Then in the divisional round, we would have the Bills now visiting the Broncos. And remember, this is the game where the Jaguars went into Denver and beat the Broncos in an upset. The Bills are a much better team than the Jaguars, even though they lost to them. So if the Jaguars could do what they did to the Broncos, I think the Bills can do that as well. And then the Panthers host the Redskins, as the Panthers would have a much easier time as they beat them. And the Cowboys visit the Packers, as the Cowboys would struggle against the Packers' elite defense, and the Packers would hold on to get the win. So then the Conference Championship would be the Packers visiting the Panthers. And remember, the Packers destroyed the Panthers when they host them. Even with Bobby Herbert, the 17-point deficit that they gave on the Panthers is more than enough to cover any fuck-ups he had. So the Packers still move on to the Super Bowl, as the Patriots would host the Bills and they would beat them. So the Super Bowl would remain the same matchup, the Patriots and the Packers, but would the Packers still win? The Packers won by 14 points, if you remember real life. Because on the one hand, Favre had 3 touchdowns in that game. He was really good. Herbert is probably not going to do that good, so it could equal the score to be a tie combined with the interceptions. But the Patriots also struggled, remember, that game, as Bledsoe threw 4 interceptions as well. And they still would have to face that #1 Packers defense. But of course, the big problem is, since Herbert didn't play, and there's no way for me to calculate how many interceptions he throws, but more importantly, will they lead the points? So with that all there combined, I think the Packers would do just enough to edge out the Patriots in this scenario to still get the win. So now, here was part 1 of 1992 to 1996. But what will happen in part 2 as we go through 1997 to 2001, as Favre still hasn't won a Super Bowl, but the Packers got? Well, what will change in this upcoming part 2? You'll have to find out. So see you guys for part 2, hopefully very soon.